Welcome to this class on the letter of James. Today we're going to be looking at identity in the early Jesus movement and talk about a little bit about reading and politics. That's actually going to be in another lecture, but for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to look at how identity became a incredible issue in the development of the early Jesus movement. In that process, we're going to be looking at a couple of other Jewish leaders and a Jewish sect, as well as the New Testament, to see how identity in the first century was constructed from the point of view of Jewishness or Judeanness. So we're going to look at some of these Judean writings from the first century. I'll just say a little bit about the word Jewishness and Judeanness and try to couch this in the concept of identity. The word Jewish tends to be a religious term for Americans who are non-Jewish. It refers to the religion like Christianity. And that's why a lot of people in the early New Testament scholars and early Jewish scholars talk about Jewishness, because religion as we understand it today existed very differently in the first century, even with Judeanness and this emerging Christian movement. Or the Jesus movement. So identity, from a Judean standpoint, identity is firmly, especially in the first century, firmly connected to land. So a Judean is someone who is from the land of Judea. A Roman is a person from the land of Rome. A Corinthian is a person from the place of Corinth. So those are geographical understandings of identity. And so Judean and Judeanness are those people who are associated with the land of Judea. And you could be associated with the land of Judea even if you weren't born in that land. So Philo, for instance, is an Alexandrian Jew or Judean from Egypt. So he wasn't born in Judea, but his parents were Judean. And so ethnically, he is a Judean. So ethnic understanding of identity isn't associated to land as much as it is to ancestry. Who your ancestors are, who your parents and grandparents are. And that doesn't have to be associated with land, but it still kind of is. So those are at least two different levels of identity, land and ancestry. And something close to it is political designation. So in the Greco-Roman period, specifically the Roman period, if you were a Judean or Jewish, that you had political rights because they were monotheistic, and they, because of that, their faith was ancient. Romans gave them certain political not advantages by any stretch of the imagination, but some freedom to worship the God of Judea without having to worship any of the Roman gods. So you have geographic, ethnic, political terminology used around identity, and also religion. So those people from Judea worshiped the God of Judea or the God of Israel. And that God was a very local God. And within the Greco-Roman period, there were many local gods. So it wasn't hard for Romans to understand this. But the worship and liturgy and ritual related to a local God could also be a major component of identity. So Judeans were people from Judea who were had ancestors who were Judean. They worshiped the local God of Judea, and they were known politically outside of Judea as such. So identity in the first century has implications for all of those things: land, ancestry, religion, and politics. So I want to, as we talk about the development of identity in first century Greco-Roman world for those who understood themselves as Judeans, all this comes into play. So identity isn't some kind of simple thing that we can just talk about in the context of the first century. The first century that gave rise to this Jesus movement and all these texts that are in the New Testament that are associated with it, and texts that are not in the New Testament. So let's look at how some of these first century Judeans negotiated their identity. Specifically Philo and Alexandria. Philo was incredibly educated, certainly a philosophical education. He was literate, he could read, he could write, and he wrote a lot. In some of his writings, Embassy to Gaius, this is a writing describing an embassy from the Judeans in Alexandria, Egypt, who sent a group of people, an embassy, to Gaius, who was the Roman emperor at the time, trying to help the Roman emperor understand their situation in Alexandria, and reporting that they weren't doing anything malicious. This was important because it was all about identity. What did it mean to be a Judean in Alexandria, Egypt? Alexandria was founded by Alexander the Great. It was thoroughly Greek. It was one of the major cities in the first century, really from the 4th century BC or BCE up until the 1st century. It was still an educational and academic center. Philo lived there as a Judean. It looks like he was born and raised there. So he was thoroughly Alexandrian. He wrote in incredible Greek, so he is thoroughly Greek. But his primary identity was one of a Judean, and he interpreted the Hebrew scriptures through that lens and gave interpretations that were very philosophical, Platonic even. You could tell that Philo was deeply educated in Plato's work, and the way he understood the world was thoroughly Platonic. The way he interpreted the Hebrew scriptures in his writings were deeply ingrained in Greek philosophy. And so here you have a Judean living in Alexandria, Egypt, who was thoroughly Greek because of his education in North Africa, and he interpreted his education. He used his in education to interpret Hebrew scriptures, not just for himself, but for his larger audience. And the way he did that, with his understanding of really being Judean or Jewish, if you want to use that word, was thoroughly influenced by how his readings of Plato and Greek philosophy. So here you have a Jew who doesn't speak Hebrew probably at all, only speaks Greek, has a great education, and yet is deeply religious in the religion of Judea and worshiping the God of Judea. It's actually his religious fidelity to the covenant with the God of Israel that causes him to write all this material. So the question is, what makes a Judean a Judean? What makes a Jew in the first century? And for Philo, it's certainly fidelity or faithfulness to the Torah, and the faithfulness and fidelity to the God of Judea. It doesn't have to do with the language. It doesn't have to do with maybe some of the customs. He was thoroughly Hellenized. You'll hear Hellenized used a lot. in the sense that Hellenization was the spread of Greek culture. Well, Alexandria was a Greek city from the beginning to the end. It happened to be in North Africa where Alexander spread the Greek, his kingdom going east. So here you have a real interesting character in Philo who is deeply faithful to the God of Israel and the Torah, but thoroughly Greek, and living within the Roman Empire and negotiating his identity in that context. The next character is Josephus, and so Josephus was born and raised in Judea. He was a Judean from the homeland that was a general in the Jewish army, or the Judean army, that fought against the Roman Empire from 66 to 70, that culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple. And it was in that war that Josephus was taken prisoner. Very interesting story around that Josephus narrates. He was taken prisoner and shipped back to Rome, and was so popular he was inducted into the Flavian household. So the Flavians were the ruling family of the Roman Empire at the time. These were the Roman emperors. It was the emperor's family. And Josephus was taken into the emperor's family and became known as Flavius Josephus. And it was in that context that he wrote his 20-volume Jewish Antiquities that basically outlined the history of the Judean people and their relationship to their God and their surrounding areas from Abraham to the present. He also wrote a multi-volume treatise on the Jewish wars. He wrote a 2-volume work against Apian and a single volume on his life. So Josephus wrote a lot. And it was interesting because Josephus was literate, of course. He wrote in Greek, only in Greek. But his Greek wasn't as good as Josephus. His Greek wasn't as good as Philo. The Greek that he wrote in was kind of leaned towards the Koine side, the common Greek that you would speak on the streets, not the academic Greek that you would write with. So Josephus does his Judeanness, his Hebrewness, really comes through much more than Philo's does. Philo writes in really good Attic Greek. Josephus kind of writes in Atticized Koine. And the reason he wrote was almost an apologetic for the war with Rome. He criticizes the Judeans who revolted against Rome, but he also criticizes the local Roman governors who he felt were too strict and too harsh on the Judean people. So he is in a precarious situation in the sense that he is in Rome. He's writing all these treaties to kind of apologize and to say the Jewish people are really good people, but we're in a terrible circumstance and there was no way out of it. So here you have a man who many people considered a traitor because the people he was leading, they basically took a suicide pact and everybody killed themselves except for Josephus. And then he said that it was ended up being God's will that he not taken his own life and became a prisoner of war. So Josephus is a real interesting character in that regard, and a lot of people consider him a traitor to his own people. But here's a traitor trying to negotiate identity and talk about identity in a way that sheds good light on his people from Judea, but also kind of says that there were some bad people there and it was just them that caused all the problems. So he's very different than Philo, but still negotiating Judean identity in Rome, in the city of Rome, in the center of the empire after being taken away from Judea. So you got two very different kind of identities and identity negotiation in Philo and Josephus. And then we move into the Dead Sea Scrolls. Um, these were all written in Judea. They were all written in Hebrew, not in Greek. That's very important. This is a mother tongue document written by people who were deeply religious. Their entire, they had a community rule that said this is what it means for you to be inside this community. Some people associate the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Essenes, who were ascetics. They lived in the desert, and that's where these scrolls were found in around the Dead Sea in a cave in an area called Qumran. And the kind of Judeanness in these documents is incredibly conservative. So these Judeans felt like, and this is in the same time period as Josephus. So this is before or during the war with Rome in the first century, middle of the first century. These Judeans felt like the temple in Jerusalem was so corrupt that God had left the temple and that the priesthood were completely heretical. So the people of the Dead Sea Scrolls that produced it, they withdrew from Jerusalem and withdrew worship from the temple and worshipped on their own in the Judean wilderness. From their writings, it does not seem like there's a lot of knowledge of Greek, or if there is, it's not. But it's not portrayed there. They hand wrote the Isaiah scroll. They were writing scriptures. They were writing documents that governed their community. And so these guys totally withdrew from society, Judean society, and created kind of their own sect in the desert, away from mainstream Judeanness. So these are a very conservative group of Judeans who felt like mainstream Jerusalem and mainstream Judeanness became too Roman, too Greek, too assimilated into those cultures, and they were fighting for purity in a strict sense. Where they wouldn't even associate with non-Judeans. And then the Judeans that they would associate with had to be of their own, their own sect. So they understood all Judeans living in mainstream society as corrupt and fully assimilated with Greco-Roman values. So these guys totally withdrew from society. And I offer this up to show you that in this first century, you had an example in Philo, an example in Josephus, and an example in the Dead Sea Scrolls of three fundamentally different ways to negotiate Judeanness within Judea and without Judea, outside of Judea, in northern Africa and Alexandria, and a Judean who was taken away to Rome. These are three very different ways to negotiate Judean identity. And it's in this same time that Jesus was born, raised, went into ministry, was killed, and then resurrected. This is the same time period. And so the writings in the New Testament show us other ways. And so the whole Jesus movement from the very beginning was Jewish. It was a Judean, Galilean movement. Where the followers understood Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. So the books of the New Testament, the letters and the Gospels and the Revelation, all these books deal with identity and are negotiating identity based on their understanding of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. The interesting thing about the New Testament is that they do it differently. So let's turn to some of these passages that we'll use as examples of how this functions. So we're going to look at James, Matthew, a couple of passages from Paul, and a couple of passages from Luke in Acts. So we'll see how the Jesus movement from the very beginning had, even in the New Testament, has very different ways to negotiate Judean believers in Jesus as the Messiah, the implications for that for identity. This is a class on James, so we'll start there. This is James 1:26 through 27. That's a typo. So 26 through 27. This is the theme of the entire letter of James, and it really sums up identity. This is an old icon of James, by the way, and that's writing in Greek. You can if you can read Greek, you might be able to read that. But the top right section of that icon, Yelkabus, that's Greek for James. So this theme passage here says, if anything, they are religious and do not bridle their tongues, but deceive their hearts. Their religion is worthless. So this idea of religion or piety has to do with actions, right? Then 27, religion that is pure and undefiled. So already we know that James is going to concentrate on this idea of purity and this undefiled nature. This sounds already, if you look at these Jewish identities that we just constructed from Philo, Josephus, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, the idea of purity is deeply within the Dead Sea Scrolls. Religious purity is a primary issue. They go on for pages and pages in some of those writings about purity. So James is already, by the vocabulary he's using, putting himself in a sectarian camp of purity, which seems very conservative, right? So religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for the widow and orphans in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So there are actions associated with this kind of identity, how you care for orphans and widows, the most vulnerable people in society when they are in distress. The way you care for them is an example of your identity, right? The other one is being unstained by the world. So this idea of unstained, undefiled, that's a negative way of saying pure. So James really is kind of demarcating himself from the world. And he uses the world quite a bit and in very strategic locations in his letter. So in James, you get something like an Essene movement, the Dead Sea Scroll movement, where he's drawing a line between the identity he's constructing and the world. And we don't know, it doesn't look like a full withdrawal from society like what you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but you definitely see antithesis here between the identity that James is espousing and the one of the world. And the world here, it leaves you to wonder, is this the Roman Empire? Is this Judeans who are assimilating Roman imperial culture? Is it both of those things? We'll deal with that as we get into the letter of James. But here you have James, most likely the brother of Jesus, from the same family of Jesus, being very conservative in the way he's negotiating identity. It is an us and them type of identity, and it's very Jewish. If we move to Matthew, especially this story of the Canaanite woman in Matthew 15 verses 21 through 28, this is a great example of how a New Testament author is negotiating Judean identity. And here we specifically have the context of negotiating Judean identity in relation to other or Gentiles. So Matthew uses the Gospel of Mark as a resource when he's writing his Gospel. And this story in Matthew 15 is found in Mark chapter 7. This is where Matthew gets the story. And in the Gospel of Mark, Mark calls this woman a Syrophoenician. Syrophoenicia was an area just north of Galilee. This is the area that Jesus withdrew to in these stories. He got out of Galilee, which was mostly a Jewish region, and went into a non-Jewish Gentile region of Syrophoenicia, where there's the two towns, Tyre and Sidon. And he looks like he's going to get away from it all. So Mark tells this story of the Syrophoenician woman. Well, Matthew, in Matthew's story, he doesn't call her a Syrophoenician. He calls her a Canaanite. And that's incredibly important because Canaanites didn't exist in the time of Jesus. These were the ancient enemies of the Hebrew people who came into the area of Judea after they escaped slavery in Egypt. So these people, the Canaanites, had not existed for centuries by the time Jesus was here. So that's incredibly important because Matthew makes this an abstract story. And he's saying very specifically that this woman isn't just a Gentile. She's like a historic and ancient enemy of Judeans. So Matthew kind of heightens the sense of division here. She's not just a Gentile. She is like the worst kind of Gentile by calling her a Canaanite. And basically, she approaches Jesus and asks Jesus to heal her daughter who has a demon, some kind of demon. And Jesus kind of responds to her in a progressive way. Initially, he's silent. He doesn't say anything. And so his disciples say, send this woman away. And then he says, I've been sent to the lost children of the house of Israel. In other words, Jesus' mission, according to Jesus in Matthew, is not to engage with Gentiles. He says specifically that he is sent to the lost children of Israel. And so he basically says, I'm refusing to deal with you. Well, she keeps on. She's unrelenting. And then he denigrates her. And he says, should we give food for children to dogs? So there's the children of Israel that he's called to, the lost children of Israel. And then he says, instead of giving it to these children, should I give it to dogs? He calls her a dog. And her response is, even dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. So through this process, from silence to refusal to denigration, it kind of gets worse. She continues to respond with stronger and stronger persistence and faith. To the point where Jesus finally says, okay, it's done, your daughter's healed, and you have great faith. And so it ends with what sounds like something good. In verse 28 it says, Jesus answers her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done to you as you wish." That's all he says. That's not a lot of praise. Great is your faith. Let it be done to you as you wish. And her daughter was healed. So at the very end of the story, Jesus finally accepts her request, but with a lot of reluctance. And so what you get in this story in Matthew, and Matthew is called the most Jewish of the Gospels. He's deeply, deeply Judean. What you get in the Gospel of Matthew is a very conservative concept of Judeanness, a very law-observant, Torah-observant faith that accepts Gentiles, but very reluctantly. This woman characterizes all non-Judeans in the Gospel of Matthew. And so Matthew's relation to Gentiles is one of reluctant acceptance. So James, we don't hear so much about acceptance as this pure identity. Matthew holds on to that purity, but crosses those lines between Jew and Gentile, but does so very reluctantly. Matthew in the gospel is always reluctant in the way he engages Gentiles in the Jesus movement. And then we get to Paul, and Paul is almost just the opposite. And In Galatians chapter 1, 13 through 3, 5, Paul deals specifically with the way Gentiles are incorporated into this Jesus movement, which is very Jewish. Paul is certainly Jewish himself. In all his autobiographical flourishes in his letters, he talks about being a Jew among Jews, a Benjaminite, a Pharisee, a Hebrew of Hebrews, studied by a noted Jewish scholar in Jerusalem, Gamaliel. So he really does kind of champion his Judeanness. But, if Acts is right, Acts says he's from Tarsus, so he's not even Judean. He's Judean, but from the diaspora. He's from outside of the Holy Land. But he is the one who revolutionizes the way the Jesus movement engages Gentiles, specifically related to the law. He basically says that the law is unimportant for Gentiles, and that his gospel is a law-free gospel, and that he's not chained to that law in the way he understands Gentiles, specifically related to circumcision. Paul says that Gentiles do not have to be circumcised in order to be followers of Jesus. Now, that is radical, because if anybody was going to become a follower of the Judean God, this was a mark of that conversion. And so circumcision was absolutely necessary for Gentiles who wanted to fully convert to follow the monotheism of Judeans and worship the God of Judea. Circumcision was a mark of the covenant. And Paul basically said they didn't have to. This was a major, major issue in early Christianity. And Paul's innovation here basically told Gentiles that they didn't have to do that. And he had a ton of opposition, and he talks about the opposition that he faced in his own letters. We read about it in Acts. So Paul is a controversial figure, and the way he understands Gentiles is fairly radical and certainly unorthodox within the early Judean identity, even for Jesus followers. You just don't get this in Matthew. You don't get this in James. You get it with Paul. He's the one that says that the good news that he preaches is for Gentiles. He understands himself as called directly to Gentiles. And his gospel is one where Gentiles don't have to obey the law and be circumcised. So that is fairly radical. He also talks about Judeans and Jews in Romans chapter 9 through 11. And he talks about law, promise, and place. He basically says that Judeans or Jews still need to follow the law, and that God's promise to them as a chosen people has not been annulled because of Jesus Christ, and they still enjoy a place of favor with God. But if that's all true, then what's the importance of Jesus for Jews and Judeans? And so Paul negotiates that in Romans chapter 9 through 11. But this incorporation of Gentiles, without Gentiles having to go through specific religious rites and rituals, was a radical thing in early Judaism. And this would be we'll discuss this a lot in our class, but he's negotiating an identity for early Jesus followers that will bring Gentiles and Judeans together around the person of Jesus instead of around the laws of God. And that is a radical shift in early Christianity. And a lot of the New Testament is devoted to it, specifically Acts. Acts tells the story of how this early Jesus movement grew. Here's a great, and by the way, this to go back, that is an old mosaic of in the first 400 or 500 years of the Jesus movement of Paul. So that's a mosaic on a wall. Here you get this engraving of Peter's vision in chapter 10, verses 1 through 48 of Acts. So Peter has this vision that a sheet containing all these unlawful animals to eat, non-kosher animals, are being descended down. Here you can see clearly a pig's face. You can see a crab across shellfish. You can see fish with scales on it and some other animals that were ritually unclean and Jews weren't supposed to eat them. Well, Peter has this vision of an angel bringing all these animals down, and the angel says, "Take and eat." And Peter refuses. And he refuses 3 times. And God finally says, "What I have made clean is clean indeed. Take and eat." So this vision that Peter has is the way Acts talks about the incorporation of Gentiles into the Jesus movement. So Cornelius is a Roman, which is even kind of the worst of the worst for Acts of the Apostle. These are the guys who destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, destroyed Judea. The Romans were the evil empire. And here you have one of their leaders who's having faith in the Jesus movement. And Peter has no choice, even though he's reluctant at first and says, "No, I won't eat this food because it's not, the Bible says not to." God commands him to do it. So this is how Gentiles are incorporated according to Luke Acts. So here you don't have you don't have a reluctant Jesus who's accepting Gentiles. You actually have a command from God to the early Jesus followers to do this. And so there's less ambiguity there, and more acceptance of Gentiles. Later on in chapter 15, Paul lays his gospel in front of James and Peter and the other leaders in Jerusalem. And he basically says, it's a law-free gospel where they shouldn't have to be circumcised. And you have a mediated position here. The council, this is such a big deal. There's all these leaders in the Jesus movement are convening in Jerusalem, and they're really grappling with this decision about whether Gentiles have to be circumcised or not. It's there in Acts chapter 15. And after a long, deliberate argument, conversation, council, James, who's like the noted leader, basically says, we're going to accept this. They don't have to be circumcised, but they write a little letter and says that they had to comply with a couple of laws, right? They had to, they couldn't eat blood. They had to stay away from blood. They had to stay away from fornication, whatever that is. They couldn't eat meat sacrificed to idols. So these were all, parts of the Jewish law or the Torah. And so it wasn't a complete law-free position, but it was circumcision-free. So the decision was reached that circumcision wasn't a primary indicator for identity in the Jesus movement. So that's very different than what you get in Matthew. And it's also a mediated position between Paul, because Paul in Galatians said after this meeting, all they asked him to do was remember the poor. Well, Luke in Acts tells us that James actually tells us more than that. And we don't really know what James actually told him. It would be interesting if we ever could find a writing from James that actually said what he told Paul at that meeting. It may be even more conservative than what Luke Acts tells us, because we know that Luke Acts is really trying to incorporate Gentiles and is very Gentile friendly. So there's a movement from very conservative identity in Jesus that is an us-them situation to a reluctant acceptance of Gentiles, to a full acceptance of Gentiles and kind of a mediated acceptance of Gentiles where they're totally in, but there's a couple of things they have to do. All that is being negotiated in this early Jesus movement. And the New Testament bears witness to this, how they're mediating this identity within Judeanness. Even we don't have Gentiles telling us how they're negotiating their identity within the Jesus movement, because none of them are writing. The only writings that we have in the New Testament are from Jewish or Judean authors who are writing from that perspective. And so it's a pretty fascinating issue that we're dealing with here. And identity ends up being the main thing. Who are we? What does this movement mean? And how do we move forward? Those are exactly the questions they were asking about within early Jesus and the early Jesus movement. Is this a Jewish and Judean only type thing? Or does this thing break out of that and become something else? And how much do you accept others in and maintain your Judeanness? This is a major issue throughout early Christianity. That's the lecture today on identity in an ancient context, especially the emergence of the New Testament, has huge implications for the letter of James, as we'll see through the rest of the semester. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and slideshow. If you have any questions, simply send me an email.